There we go. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate being here. I love the opportunity to get out. And I am an economic consultant, ag economics consultant. I worked for Nebraska Farm Bureau for about 30 years. Spent the last 8 or 9 years in kind of the economics field. Before that, I was a lobbyist for the organization, worked out at the Nebraska legislature and out in DC working on some issues. So I got a little policy bent about me too. I hope the fact that I'm a lobbyist doesn't bother you too badly. You know, lobbyists aren't too well thought of, right? You know, people think of cigars and money under the table and drinks and that kind of stuff. When my wife and I moved into the house that we live in now, the neighborhood had a little welcoming gathering because there was a couple other families that moved in about the same time, and we had to introduce ourselves and say where we lived, who we are, what we did, that kind of thing. And I got up and introduced myself, said I was a lobbyist, and my wife is an attorney. And so I said, introduced my wife Jan, she's an attorney here in town. One of my new neighbors said, "Holy cow, this neighborhood's gone to hell." So I hope you won't hold that against me. I am from Nebraska. I was born in Nebraska, native of Nebraska, live there, but I really relish the opportunity to come over. You know, they always say you should try to make some kind of connection with your audience. My Iowa connection is when my family, wing of the family, came over from Germany back in, I think it was 1855. They settled in Iowa, Fort Madison, does that sound right? Okay, Fort Madison, Iowa, had some land there. And for some unknown reason, my great-grandfather decided to move from there in the family and go to south central Nebraska and settle there and buy some land there, and the rest is history. And my uncle eventually took over the farm, and I always teased him about why in the heck did great-grandfather give up that good Iowa land to come to Nebraska, because it's drier, it's harder to make a living over there, but he did. So that's my Iowa connection. What I want to try to do today is run down a little bit of the state of the farm economy. And when I say farm economy, I mean farmers and ranchers, the folks out on the land, the ones that you're dealing with. Try to give you a little sense of what's happening out there. And I always try to remind myself this, I love this Lyndon B. Johnson quote that I like this stuff, I get passionate about it, not everybody does, and it's kind of like pissing down your leg. It's hot to you, but not to anybody else. So I try to remember that and go through this kind of, well, just touch things, kind of go through a little faster fashion. But please, I want this to be interactive. I want you to, if I say something that you got a further question on, please raise your hand, get my attention. If you disagree with something I say, please let me know, because you guys are on the ground. You know what's going on out there. So I want to hear that. So what I want to try to do is talk a little about the current situation, the status quo, give you a little bit of an outlook, what we're seeing in the grain markets and maybe the livestock markets, and then talk a little bit about some factors that are going to influence what's happening in the markets that are kind of out there, kind of some of the uncertainties right now. All right, so current status, I'm going to say it's okay, but stress is building. And I'll explain why I say that here in a little bit. This first shows net farm income for across the country in inflation-adjusted dollars, and it goes back to the turn of the century to 2000. And the lighter blue color is the portion of government payments that are going towards that net farm income. And what I want you to notice, you can see 2011, 2013 were pretty good years. Everybody looks back to them, and corn and soybean prices went up. Everybody thought, hey, things are doing pretty well. When you get to 2021 and further right, you can see that the income, actually national income, net farm income on a real basis was higher than it was in 11-13, which is kind of interesting to me because at least when I talk to farmers and ranchers, you don't get that sense out of them that those few years there, the last 2 or 3 years were as good as they were. But you can see in inflation dollars, we set records over the last 2 or 3 years in net farm income. And a lot of that, if you get beyond 2020 and 2021, a lot of that isn't from government payments. Very small share of that is from government payments. And so that's coming out of the market. And so that's reflective of the prices that we've seen in the last few years until, 2024, 2023, they started coming off. So that's, our income situation in the last few years is good. So you can see the very last bar there is 2025, it's got an asterisk on it. That is the USDA's forecast for this year. And look where it's at, it's up. And if it's realized, it would be the second highest on record. that we have. And when I tell that to a lot of people, they think, what? That isn't going to happen. I'll tell you what, now that's a forecast, and they're sitting in February looking out, trying to figure out what's going to happen to this year's crop and prices and everything else. So take that as a grain of salt, but I'll explain it in a little bit why they've done that and what people think about that. So farm income has been good. So farmers have been building up working capital, have been having some cash on hand. So here is another snapshot of something we economists look at to measure farm health, farm debt. And you can see, you probably can't, if you can see the years on the bottom, it starts with 1970 and goes up to estimates for 2025. You can see the 80s in there. For those of us that lived through the 80s, remember what happened then with the high farm debt and the land bought prices crashed and it was a mess. So you can see what happened, and again, this is inflation adjusted dollars. So since 2000, farm debt has been growing steadily over time. And that's, again, inflation-adjusted dollars going up. And you can see we've reached levels that are higher than what were in 1980, or in the mid-1980s. And so some people are saying, uh-oh, are we heading into another kind of a 1980s repeat? Is something happening there? We'll talk a little bit in the next slide about that. But a couple things I want to talk about on this, on the debt. I think there's a couple reasons it's happening. One is from 2000 on, farm incomes have been better, as you saw on that chart. So farmers are taking some of that extra income and reinvesting in land. Land prices have been going up. So in order to buy the land, they got to pay a little more, maybe take on a little debt. And then interest rates until last couple of years have been very low historically. And so farmers their debt capacity is a lot higher, so they can take on more debt. So I think that's what we're seeing reflected in there. And you can see most of that growth in the debt is on the real estate side. The non-real estate, like your operating loans, your equipment loans and things, are fairly flat or stable over time. So land values, I mentioned that land values have been going up. So this comes from Iowa State. It's the percentage change in land values from year to year, going way back to I think the 1950s to 2020. I couldn't find one that had the latest few years on it. If I did, the red line would be going above the black bar at 0 across there. But there's a couple things that jump out at me about this graph. And last week I presented in Nebraska, and I had one for Nebraska too, and it's very, very similar. But look at how the black bar is 0%, so that means no change in land values. Look how many times the red line, how much the line is above the black bar. So year after year after year, we're seeing land values go up. And the other thing, I don't know if you can see, this line here is a 20% line. How many times on the upside those values hit the 20% line? And then conversely on the bottom, the only time it hits that 20% line is a couple times in the 80s. So land values over time are going to go up. I think there's a couple reasons. One, they're not making any more land, right? And every year we're taking a little more as Des Moines grows, as some of the other cities grow, we're taking a little more out, so it's getting a little more scarce. And so prices go up. And we're seeing it. In fact, University of Illinois has a land study or land research institute. They said if you look over time at the return to land, it averages about 10% from like the mid-1950s. A lot of that is because of capital returns, capital gains on that land. 1 to 2% of it is because of annual rent or annual income from it. So land values go up. So that means the asset base that the farmers are borrowing against are going up and gives their capacity more. So here's why I say we're not heading, right now anyway, to a repeat of the 1980s. This is a measure, this is their debt to equity ratio and debt to asset ratio, again for the United States as a whole, for farmers. And you can see it measures the solvency or the long-term, can this operation stay in business? And the spikes that you see are from the 1980s. So we got really high, 20 to 25% in that time frame. Here lately we've been down 14% and 12%. So even though the debt level has gone up, the asset base has gone up too. And so those solvency ratios are staying in areas where we like to see them. They're not getting out of whack. So that tells me in the long term that the farm economy is doing okay. Now, does that mean that there are no problems? No. We are seeing cracks showing. So one of the first cracks, I always like to follow Chapter 12 bankruptcies, farm bankruptcies. There's a special code in federal law for farm bankruptcies. This comes from American Farm Bureau. This tracks farm bankruptcies from 2015 to 2024. The light blue here is the Midwest region, which Iowa would fall in. So generally, of the number of bankruptcies out there, the Midwest region will have the most, and that's basically because we have the most farm operations, right? So this includes all the Corn Belt states and some of the major crop production states and livestock production states. So you can see that bankruptcies peaked in 2019 at 599. In the Midwest region, we had 275. And then when we saw some of those good income years come in, it fell back quite a bit to a low in 2023 of 139 nationwide. So we saw good income come in, farm bankruptcies fall off. In 2024, we start to saw a few of them go back up a little bit again. They started picking up. In fact, in percentage terms, they were up 55% compared to 2024. And you think last year we had lower commodity prices, our input costs still were relatively high, and then interest costs went up because interest rates were going up. So that put some pressure. Now that doesn't mean that those operations are going out of business. Some of them probably did, but it just means that their financial circumstances reached a point that they had to go through the bankruptcy process to try to refinance their operations and set them up. So that shows some cracks are showing. The map shows the changes in bankruptcy from 2023 to 2024. You probably can't see Iowa on there, I apologize. There were 2 additional bankruptcies in 2024 compared to 2023. And so I meant to look at how many total bankruptcies that would make, and I forgot to do it. I apologize. But still, Iowa's in great shape, great situation, but some cracks are starting to show. This comes from the Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City. Nebraska is part of that. Iowa's out of the Chicago Federal Reserve District, and I tried to find similar data out of them, and they didn't have it, so I went ahead and used this. This shows a couple things measuring liquidity and repayment rates. They survey their bankers every quarterly that do a lot of ag business. The dark black lines going across the middle of the graph means that things are perfectly neutral, that bankers see like 50% of the bankers see things improving, 50% of them see them not improving or worsening. So this is the repayment rate. This is their index on repayment rates on loans. You can see here when income was good, we saw repayment rates get a lot better. They were above neutral. That means repayment rates are improving. Now they're slipping over the last couple of years, dropping back down again. Same thing, this one shows farm income and borrower liquidity. When incomes were up, we saw them improve. Now they're back down below that neutral line, so they're worsening. And both for liquidity and income. And you can see, at least on liquidity and income, we're hitting levels down below or same levels that we saw in 15 and 16 and 17 when the farm economy was struggling. So again, they're another sign that the cracks are starting to show. But when you talk to farmers, or you ask farmers, at least through surveys, ask them how it's going, their sentiment is good. At least shown by surveys. This comes out of the University of Purdue. They survey 400 farmers across the country every month and they turn those results into what they call an ag economy barometer. And on the left is kind of the overall barometer. You can see it shot up late last fall quite a bit in 1 month's time, and it's been bouncing around up there at a pretty good territory. Now part of that, I'm going to admit, is due to politics, because obviously a lot of farmers were President Trump supporters or Republicans, and so when Trump got elected, they thought, hey, things are going to get better, and it jumped up quite a bit. And then on the right shows their responses to, are you thinking about investing in capital improvements in land or equipment or what? And you see that shot up too, that line, on the bar on the right, up quite a bit from what it was last fall. But when you go look at what they're actually doing with their wallets, that's not showing up. I don't know if you guys have seen this. This comes out of the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. It tracks combine and tractor sales. The black line at the bottom is this year. So you can see that combine and tractor sales are trailing. The blue line is last year, and the red line is 5-year average. So they're not, even though their sentiment is good, they're not opening up their wallets and coming to you and saying, I want, to purchase something. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there with what they're saying and the reality. And it's kind of the inverse of what we're seeing out of consumers right now. Consumers are saying, uh-oh, I'm not liking where this economy is headed. I'm worried about inflation. I'm worried about my job. And consumer sentiment in some indexes are the lowest, or near the lowest they've been since they started measuring it. But when you look at when they go out, their spending is going up yet. I think last month, real inflation-adjusted spending went up 1%. I saw something yesterday that spending on food went up over the last year 5 or 6%. So it's kind of the reverse of what we're seeing out of consumers. So where we're at right now, I'm going to say that the underlying conditions are fairly good, fairly strong. Because of those income years, the solvency ratios, things are looking okay in terms of the health of the operations out there. Land values are moderating. We're seeing those pull back. Last report I just heard in Nebraska from last year, we saw them slip by like 1 or 2% or something. I'm guessing Iowa would be the same way, but they're hanging in there. They're not crashing or anything. But we're seeing those signs of stress. Repayment rates are softening, delinquency rates are rising. When farmers are starting to take, one reason they're taking on more debt is because to cover they're burning through their working capital and their cash a little bit, so they're taking on more debt. Bankruptcies are ticking higher. And I think we're seeing that even though the survey shows farmers are feeling fairly positive about things, they're not spending their money with their wallets, and we're seeing that through equipment sales. All right, so the outlook. What's the rest of the year look like? I always like to, I don't know, Rupert Murdoch, he must not have been a fan of economists because he thinks we're about equivalent to weather forecasters. A lot of times that's true. One fellow economist said trying to forecast the future is like a drunk monkey throwing darts at a dartboard, and you never know where it's going to hit and land. So I hopefully will do a little bit better than a drunk monkey, but we'll see. We'll see how the year turns out. And I will say, I did, before I got into the economics gig, I traded commodities for 5 years for a small firm in Omaha, and I got out of that business, and we'll just leave it at that, okay? So when I start talking about commodity markets, we'll take that in May. All right, corn. This came out of the USDA, their latest outlook, in 2 weeks ago, actually. And I stole this. Last week I used a USDA chart, but I like this one better. This came from Chad Hart at Iowa State University because it goes back a little further in time, and you can see the evolution of things a little bit, particularly the prices at the bottom. But this is the balance sheet that everybody watches that the USDA puts out on trying to figure out where the markets are headed. And we're going to go through corn and soybeans. The first thing I want to point out is this number right here down at the bottom. This is the ending stocks coming out of this last crop year, the 24 crop. We're still going through the marketing year. It ends August 30th, but that 1.4 billion, that kind of shocked the market when that came out a couple weeks ago. Everyone expected that to be higher. The USDA bumped up their latest forecast for this year for feed usage and exports. And I'll show you a graph here in a little while about what exports have been doing. And you can see corn exports have been a surprise. They've been going up this year. So that was the first kind of shocker out of this report. The other thing, the parts I have circled there, those are their projections for this year for crop production. You can see acres are up almost 5 million acres over last year. And then the yield at 181 bushels an acre is just a trend yield. They just put a line through the past history, and where that line points to, that's their first. It doesn't have any basis in reality, I guess, if you will, in terms of current conditions and what they think about the planting pace, the weather, whatever. It's just a trend line. It's their first shot at what are yields going to be. If you take those two numbers, you get to 15.8 billion bushels. That would be a record crop for the United States if we get to that. 15.8 billion. So that's one thing. Remember that number. The second part is down here in the gray box. The feed and residual and the export numbers, they bumped up quite a bit, or somewhat, from last year, from this year. And that was a bit of surprise out there too. So you crunch through all the numbers, and they end up with a price forecast of $4.20 per bushel at the farm gate. So a little lower than where things are trading at right now, at least on the futures market right now. And you can see that's down quite a bit from the 654 in 2022. So prices have come off over $2 a bushel over the last couple of years. Now, there's kind of two schools of thought about this outlook. One is that there's no way we're going to hit that 181 on yield. There's just too many outstanding factors in terms of weather, the growing conditions and the like, that we're not going to hit that 181. So production is going to pull back. Demand, though, is going to stay good. And so we're going to see those prices go up a little bit. Nothing earth-shattering, but we've seen, the market has absorbed the big crop news. It didn't go down. It's hanging in there. In fact, if you look at what happened to the market since then, it's trended up a little bit. So the market's taken that news and said, we're going to slug that off, and we don't think production's going to come in as well as it did. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is, yeah, even if production pulls back a little bit, there's no way those export numbers and feed usage is going to hang in there like that. When you look at livestock numbers are trending downward, exports with all the trade uncertainty out there, they're not going to hit those. And so that school of thought kind of is saying, we don't see much bullish. We think it's going to maybe trend down a little bit. I kind of fall in the first category. I'm coming into this report, I was pretty neutral. I didn't really have a sense one way or another. But after digesting this and watching the market's reaction, I'm slightly bullish on corn. Now that doesn't mean we're going to see it, roar up to mid $5 or whatever. But I think for the time being, we got to work through some of those growing conditions and some of the weather, and I think we'll see prices trend a little higher in that. So here's soybeans. Same information, a little different outlook in terms of production. I said corn acres were up about 5 million acres. Soybeans are off almost 4 million acres, so a lot of that increased corn that we're going to see out there planted came out of soybean. Same thing on the yield, it's just a trend line yield. And so production this year going to be a little bit less than last year. Not a whole lot, but a little bit less. And then we go down in the usage category. They're projecting to go up a little bit, and that's primarily due, I think the crush number is expected to be higher. And what they're thinking is soybean oil and soybean meal exports have been performing pretty well. We're going to see crush a little heavier because of that, and so usage is going to go up a little bit. You'll note that exports are down quite a bit, or somewhat, from last year, and so that results in a little slightly drop in ending stocks and a little bump in the price. And soybean markets reacted like that. They bumped up a little bit. We'll talk about this in just a little bit, but there's a lot of uncertainties in those usage numbers there related back to federal policy, related around renewable diesel and trade policy and the like. So a lot of what's going to happen in the soybean market is more contingent upon Washington, D.C. right now too. So that's a little bit of uncertainty out there. So let's talk a little bit about the weather outlook and the growing conditions. You can see this is the drought map as of last Thursday. They put out a new map every Thursday. You can see the Nebraska where I'm from is pretty dry. There are parts of Iowa that are pretty dry, and northern Illinois and northern Indiana. In those areas, the crop went in pretty good, pretty fast. Now they're just waiting for moisture to get the crop going. But southern Illinois and Indiana and into Ohio have been pretty wet, and there's some crop planting delays there. So a little bit of mixed news on the getting the crop in the ground. But what kind of concerns me more, and I think gives a little more credence to the bullish side of the market, this is the forecast for the next 30 days during the prime of the growing season. You see temperatures are on the right, precipitation on the left. Temperatures are expected to be greater chance of them being above normal, and then precipitation for Iowa and Nebraska are projected to be below normal. So going back to that balance sheet, that doesn't bode very well for a record crop production. So that's why I say I think I give a little more credence to the bullish side of the market in terms of some of the supplies that we'll see. But this will very much be a weather market over the next few weeks, and we'll be watching that closely. And then this also came from Chad Hart at Iowa State, and it explains why we're seeing a lot more corn acres than soybean acres. The black line across the middle is Iowa State's projection of break even for Iowa for corn and soybean production. So on the right is the break even for corn, which is $4.30. Oh, I'm sorry, on the left is break even for corn at $4.30. On the right is soybeans at $11.15. You can see corn prices, those are futures prices, are ranging above that break even, but not by much. I mean, it's pretty close. If I were a corn farmer, it'd be a little too close for me. But soybeans are trading well below that break even line. So that's why we saw the shift that we did into corn acres and the chances for profitability. So looking out this year, corn or crop production is going to be tough. It's going to be tough to return a profit, and it's all going to be about watching those costs and trying to drop that break-even point down on that graph. And so it's going to be, on the crop sector, it's going to be tough to return a positive return this year. Now, conversely, livestock have been performing very well. These are the red lines are the 2025 prices on the right for fed steers. It's the average, and the average for hogs too. I'm sorry, I keep getting my left and rights mixed up. On the left is the steers, on the right is the hogs. So you can see the red line is above what we've seen over the last few years. So in fact, those cattle prices are at record levels, and they're nearly $80 a hundredweight above what the 5-year average is. We've got fewer cattle, we've got less beef production. Beef prices are going up in the retail stores, but consumers are saying, hey, we don't care, we like our beef, we're going to keep eating it. And so that's filtering back into cattle prices. And to some extent, it's the same thing on the hog side. Even though prices at the retail level have been going up, consumers are still buying bacon, right? You see bacon in everything now. That's filtering back into the hog prices. So on the livestock side, things are looking a lot better. And these are the projections for livestock returns. The left is cattle, the right is hogs. These are Iowa State, their projections for Iowa, and then the first through April, you can see it's been black above the line, so they're making money. And then hogs too is black, they're making money. The cattle are making a lot more money than the hogs, but they are making money, and that's expected to continue out through the rest of the year. So good thing on livestock, crops, not so good. Are you guys getting sick of charts yet? We economists, we love charts and graphs. In fact, anybody heard of the board game Charty Party? No? Okay. That shows you how weird I am. Yeah, Jerry has, because he heard me talk last week. That shows you how weird I am. My kids a couple years ago got me a board game called Charty Party, and you try to read these graphs and answer questions or something. I can't quite remember, but anyway, that shows you how weird I am. So, livestock good this year, crops not so good. So, now I want to talk a little bit, particularly on the soybean side, but a little bit about some of the policy issues that could change those numbers in a hurry and could change them dramatically depending on how the decisions are made. Trade policy, tariffs. Everybody's sick of hearing about tariffs and trade policy. And the problem with giving a talk like this is things change. As Mark talked last week, and he'll probably mention again, he talks a little bit about some of the tax provisions in the budget reconciliation bill. And it was voted in, about 2 hours before you gave your presentation, and by one vote. And so when I talk a little bit about trade policy today, I don't know if you saw the news this morning about a federal court overturning Trump's tariffs. So another new wrench in the machine in terms of what's going to happen on tariff policy. You know, it kind of changes daily. But my point here, at least at start, I want to reinforce the importance of trade to agriculture and how some of these discussions that are going now could have a lot of influence on what happens in the markets. If you look here, 2000 is right here, starts about right here, that little dip in the green line. Green line is exports. Right there, ag exports are about $55 billion. And then in 2023 or 2022, they hit almost 200 billion. So quite a bit of growth since the turn of the century. And I think that's reflective in some of the better income conditions we've had since the turn of the century. We're a lot more reliant on trade to generate those revenues to get back to the farm and ranch. And the figures on the right are the USDA's figures of how much of production value is export value of that production value. And food grains, it's what, 60%? So that'd be your wheat, oats, barley. Feed grains, that's corn and sorghum, 22%. Oil seeds, 54%. So think about it, as you drive down the road, about every 1 out of every 2 soybean rows, the value of that is derived from exports. Meat, what is it, 30%, so overall 20%. So the point is, trade is important in terms of revenue source for the farms out there. Here are the largest destinations where we ship the most, the countries in green. You can see our North American neighbors are big markets for us. That's because of the free trade agreements we have with them. China is another big, huge market. That's just because they're so big and huge and have so many people. They need to feed them, and so they buy a lot of ag imports. Next to China, you can't really see it because it's right on the border. South Korea is another in green, and then Japan over there. Those, year in and year out, are typically our 5 largest markets. So when I think about the current things that are happening in trade policy, those are the countries I kind of look at to say, okay, how's this going to affect agriculture? Well, I'm going to look at the reactions of those 5 countries. And then to some extent, EU. You can see the EU shows up in a lighter green. So to tariff or not to tariff, and again, this just changed last night, but I saw a political cartoon 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was President Trump getting out of bed, still had his sleep mask on, and he was in his pajamas holding a teddy bear, and his advisor came with a big wheel of fortune wheel, and he was spinning to determine that day's tariff policy. And to some extent, it kind of feels like that. It just kind of, he's online, he's reacting to things, he sees things happen and makes decisions based on that. But, so there's a couple ways that farmers are going to be impacted by this. One is on the cost side. And to my understanding, the court's decision yesterday did not affect the steel and aluminum tariffs, additional tariffs of 25%. Did not affect automobiles. I'm unsure about farm equipment and components and where that fits in. It won't affect the chemicals one. The Commerce Department is putting extra tariffs on 2,4-D out of China and India. They went through a different process, so it's not that. Fertilizers I threw up there just because they haven't been impacted yet, but they're hanging out there. There could be a cherry that's picked. We get a lot of fertilizer out of Canada and some out of Mexico, and because of our free trade agreements, it hasn't been impacted yet. But stay tuned on that. So on the cost side, farmers are going to be seeing high costs out of these tariffs if they remain in place. And you're probably seeing that maybe already start to filter through some of the equipment. The other thing, the way they can be impacted is retaliatory tariffs. We saw that happen in 2018. Other countries that we ship to put tariffs on our ag products in response to what we were doing. And so there are those 5 countries, and their response so far. Fortunately, Mexico, Japan, and South Korea have not done anything yet. Mexico has we're threatening to put tariffs on Mexico's tomato imports. We get about 80% of our tomatoes from Mexico, and we're threatening to put tariffs on them. So they're threatening, they say, okay, if you do that, we're going to put it on chicken and pork, your chicken and pork coming into our country. So pay attention to that. Canada has done a little bit of retaliatory tariffs, but not much, nothing that will impact us right now. Japan and South Korea are holding their fire for right now. They're trying to negotiate with the Trump administration. And then China, you've read the news where we've been way up. They were going to put, like, I think 125% tariffs on our products. We were going to go 145%. We pulled back for at least a bit of a time period, I think into July, and we'll see what happens there. But so far on the retaliatory tariff side, it hasn't been too bad. But yet, even though it hasn't been too bad, you can kind of see the effects already in the market in terms, like China particularly, soybean shipments going over there, beef shipments have largely stopped just because of the uncertainty out there. So even if we were able to reach some agreement coming out of these tariffs, which I think would be a good thing, I'm a little concerned about the long term. And again, it gets back to how important ag trade is to us as a market. And there's a couple things I'm concerned about. One is that every time we go through a round of this kind of uncertainty and these tariffs and this back and forth, I think we lose a little credibility as a supplier out there. And countries start looking for other sources of supply. We're already seeing that with China and the EU are going to Brazil and Argentina. They get a greater share of their soybeans now from them. China is also looking at Brazil for beef. Japan is negotiating with Brazil for some beef. Australian beef has made some inroads into China and Japan. And so I just imagine you're dealing with either a customer or a supplier or something, and they're always changing the provisions or the conditions that you're negotiating under. It's constantly changing. You're going to start trying to find somebody else that's has a little more stability and credibility, and I think we're starting to see that. The other thing that concerns me is when you look since World War II, the United States has been in the lead in putting together a system of international rules to govern trade and capital flows. And this started 10, 15 years ago. We're seeing that start to crumble, so it's not all in this present administration. But a lot of what you're seeing here in the last few years regarding trade just totally violates what this system and the rules that we put in place. And agriculture has really thrived under those rules because one of the most sensitive areas when you're dealing with a country over trade is food and agriculture issues, right? Everybody wants to make sure that their citizens are fed. And so it takes a lot to kind of crack those markets open and get there. And I'm a little concerned about what's going to happen if we start to see these international norms, I guess, start to crumble and fall away, what that means for agriculture. And one way of seeing that is the soybean trade over the last few years. So the green is Brazil, soybean exports, the blue is the United States. Together, they're responsible for 80% of the soybean exports in the world. You can see Brazil has been growing over the last few years, or continuing to grow. But the United States, we basically mid-2015-16 have flattened out and maybe even trended lower a little bit. So we're starting to see Brazil is capturing more and more of the world soybean market from us, and I think it's kind of reflective of other countries shopping for additional suppliers. And so this just real quick snapshot of this year, what's happening in exports. Not a pretty picture. This is from the first 3 months of the year compared to last year at the same time. Everything's down except for red meats, that's pork and beef, are up slightly. This is the value of trade. So this isn't dollars, not actual bushels or pounds of meat. But the value of red meat's up a little bit. Corn is up quite a bit, up, what is that, 24%. So that's why the USDA bumped up their numbers this year on exports. Corn coming in a lot heavier than what everybody expected. Ethanol is up too. And the reason for that is Canada. Canada has some new renewable fuel standards up there. They buy our ethanol. We ship a lot of ethanol. It's grown quite a bit over the last few years. So ethanol to Canada, and Japan's looking at ethanol too, is a positive. But everything else is pretty red. Soybeans are off 33%. And that's not a pretty picture. Again, that's kind of reflective of things going to China and stuff. So overall down about 5%. So this is January through March. We really hadn't seen the effects of the tariffs in place yet. So stay tuned. So trade, one big area. The other big area is biofuels policies. There's a lot up here. Suffice it to say that the ethanol and the renewable diesel and the like are a policy-driven market. They have trouble competing in the fuels market based on their economics. It costs more to produce ethanol than a gallon of gas. It costs more to produce a gallon of renewable diesel than conventional diesel. Sustainable aviation fuel, the same thing. So there needs to be some help in the marketplace, and the federal government is obliged to come in and said, we'll help you out. There are this year, for whatever reason, the stars just lined up, a lot of policy decisions that have to be made in Washington on those policies. And they could affect both the ethanol a little bit, but more the sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. And first, ethanol. So I've got about 5 or 6 things there listed there. Some of them could be beneficial to the ethanol market. Right now, if you look at the ethanol market, it's just about 10% of the gasoline consumed. You can just peg it out. How much are people going to drive? How much gasoline are they going to burn? 10% of that's going to be ethanol, right? So a couple things that the administration can do to boost that would be year-round E15 sales, which they've done for this year, and then a rollback of the fuel economy standards on the automobile fleet. You know, ethanol doesn't burn quite as efficiently. If you pull back those fuel standards, that'll help out. On the other side, though, there are, to the renewable fuel obligations, there are some waivers that they can give for small oil refineries. There are 161 applications before the Trump administration to provide those waivers. Their first term in office, they were pretty liberal about giving those waivers, which that's a negative on the market. That means they don't have to worry about blending ethanol. Where they set the renewable fuel obligations for the next 3 years, that kind of sets the minimum on ethanol usage. And then I mentioned trade policy because of Canada and our sales to Canada. If things go haywire there, that could have an effect on the ethanol. Sustainable aviation fuel, again, a lot of the same things. The 2 biggest federal policies are the RVOs, the renewable volume obligations, and the federal tax credit, which is kind of a state of a limbo. The Biden administration was supposed to set the parameters for that credit before they left office. They didn't, and so now it's up to the Trump administration to do that. I think there's some legislation, or there's some language in the budget reconciliation bill to force them to do that, but we'll see. And then the RVOs, and then there's some state policies regarding that. And then on the renewable diesel side, same kind of policies there, maybe even more so because sustainable or the renewable diesel, again, isn't economically competitive. And so depending on the soy or where they set these policies and how much soybeans are going to be crushed and affect that crush margin for the soybean crushers. And so I put in that quote from Scott Irwin because there's a lot of uncertainty around the demand side on these biofuel areas, and there's a lot of policy decisions got to be made. And I think it's kind of a conundrum for the Trump administration because a lot of these policies were put in place as an impetus for sustainable future, to react to climate change and try to reduce our carbon footprint and the like. So that was kind of the impetus for a lot of these policies. Trump's doesn't like those kind of policies. He doesn't believe in climate change. He's not going to worry about it. And so he's got his dislike, but he recognizes that the areas, Iowa, Nebraska, and others that voted for him are supportive of these. So it's kind of it'll be interesting to watch how this plays out. But there's a lot of uncertainty out there because of these policies, and I put a little note, I added that just last week. The EPA sent their RVOs over to the White House for review, and those are the renewable fuel volume obligation, renewable volume obligations. That's what the minimums that renewable diesel, ethanol, and others need to meet in terms of blending in the market. Those weren't as high as the industry wanted, the biofuels industry wanted. So there's a little disappointment over that, so we'll have to watch how that plays out. And then last on this part, just last week, budget reconciliation package passed. Congress was unable to pass a farm bill on its own, a package separate on its own the last couple of years. Usually they try to re-up it every 5 years. They tried in 23, 24, couldn't do it. So this year they said, okay, we're going to put some of the provisions in the budget reconciliation package. It makes several changes to the farm program in an effort to try to make them a little more relevant and current with the markets. When I put that slide together, they were estimating they would cost about $60 billion. I just saw some estimates yesterday. It's about $39 billion is what they said that would add in increased payments. Unfortunately, the information I saw, most of those increased payments are going to go to peanuts and cotton and rice down in the south. Now, corn and soybeans do get some, soybeans more than corn, but that's their projections over the next 10 years is where most of the payments will go. So that was all encompassed in the budget reconciliation package. They make some changes to crop insurance, to base acres to try to improve the programs. That really won't come into play this year because payments that farmers received this year are already locked in based on what's happened last year. But it could affect things in 26, 27, and on out. So something to watch there. And it also has some tax provisions in it, which I know Mark will cover in a lot better detail than I can. So, finishing up a little bit, just touch on some other factors out there. I tried to hit on the major ones, but we can't forget about these. First, South America, our biggest competitors out there in the world market in terms of soybeans and corn and beef. And so we've got to watch what's going on there. Right now, their production is looking like it's going to be up compared to last year, so that's going to put a little additional supply on the market. That means that it's going to put a little pressure on prices. But they're struggling with some of the weather issues on their own, so watch that. Macroeconomics, this is more kind of, depending on how the Federal Reserve reacts to things, you know. They're still concerned about inflation because of the tariffs. They're watching the unemployment rate. The economic growth in the first quarter of this year was down, and so they're watching all this and could be adjusting interest rates soon, which will affect obviously the interest costs and the debt for farmers and ranchers. But also the other thing out there, protein demand is hanging in there pretty good. That tends to go with the economy and consumer sentiment. And hopefully things will keep growing and that demand will keep growing. But if we start seeing things pull back, we could see beef consumption and pork consumption pull back and then replace it with chicken, which is less expensive. So that's something to watch too. I threw in the geopolitical because who knows, you know, Russia and Ukraine and China and Middle East, anything could happen. I also want to touch on the economic uncertainty because we've heard a lot of that lately. Oh, things are so uncertain, things are so uncertain. How do we make decisions? What do we do? This chart comes from 3 professors, I think one Stanford, one University of Chicago, and one Northwestern University. And they went back and they plotted, they look at a lot of different things. They look at media reports, economist predictions, and other things to try to measure. They've created an index of economic uncertainty. And what I want to point out, this goes all the way back to prior to 1920, but you can see in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, it was right here, got up to close to 200. Here's COVID, up to 200, or here's COVID, I'm sorry, up to 200 again, or up over 300. Now it's up over 400. And so, at least by this index, the uncertainty that people are feeling out there right now is a lot more than what it has been in the past. Now, granted, the index is probably skewed a little bit because it's easier to measure. I mean, you know what you want to try to measure now, and the data's available, and you go back, 50, 60 years ago, it's a little tougher to find. But I just think it shows that people are feeling a little more uncertain. And when people feel uncertain, they pull back and try to wait it out. And that's something that's hanging over the economy right now. So, wrap up for this year. Crop producers are going to struggle. It's going to be tough to make a break even. Some of the more efficient ones that really watch their P's and Q's will probably come in a little bit okay. I think most crop producers will struggle a little bit. I'm a little concerned that we're going back to like the 2015, 16, 17 area where prices have a tendency, we're in a competitive markets, prices have a tendency to get back to the level of cost production over the long term, and I think we're seeing that here, so this might be a multi-year kind of an issue. Livestock producers, on the other hand, positive returns. There are higher prices, good consumer demand, the feed costs have moderated, so good there. Watch the policy decisions in DC. That could have a huge influence, particularly on the demand side of the equation. Higher net farm income projected, second highest. That's largely due to a couple. One is, remember Congress in December passed their ad hoc assistance for farmers out there. I think they had about $11 or $12 billion in that. That went out in April, and so that'll show up in this year's income numbers. So a lot of that spike in income is due to that government assistance that's coming out. So that's how you can kind of explain the disconnect between what you're seeing in the underlying economic fundamentals and the projections there. But livestock's also playing into that too. The positive returns coming out of livestock is helping boost that income number. And then again, we're kind of at that, I think, a tipping point right now. Things are the underlying fundamentals, when you measure farm income, wealth, and stability are fairly strong and good, but it's weakening, it's softening, it's cracking, and unless we see a dramatic turnaround in the next couple of years, we'll probably see that start to pull back, and more farmers start to feel those that stress coming through. So shameless plug here. I do put out a weekly newsletter. It comes out on Monday evenings. If you have any interest in this kind of stuff at all and would like to subscribe to it, you're more than welcome to. It's free to anybody and everybody. If you sign up for it, or shoot me an email, and I'll get you on the list, and you can take a look at it if you like it. You can keep reading it. If not, you can unsubscribe if you want. But I put it out, and it touches on a lot of these kinds of things throughout the year. And I try to watch, farmers and ranchers are on the ground. They're dealing with their day-to-day stuff about what equipment's breaking down, or what they need to do, or do they need to go out and spray, and all those kinds of things. I think they kind of lose track of some of the things happening in the world that could affect their bottom line, and I try to do that for them. I try to follow and go. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I probably didn't give you a whole lot of crystal ball into the future, but as George Shaw said, we can't ever reach a conclusion very often. So I appreciate the time, and I think, Jamie, we probably have a little question or time for some questions. If anything trips your trigger, or got any questions or thoughts?
Did they say where the 5 million more acres came from?
They didn't really say, and they'd have to go back and look at parcel down a little more to figure that out. But I think most of it came out of soybeans, just because the economics of that soybeans aren't looking as good as corn right now. So I think most of it shifted over. And I'm frankly a little surprised that we didn't see a little larger shift given the economics of it. But I think a lot of guys have their crop rotations in place, and there's a lot of agronomic reasons to rotate things through, and so that probably pulled that back a little bit. Yeah, but mostly soybeans, I think, and a little bit of cotton, I think, in the south too. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
If you can comment a little bit about the speed at which we have seen how quickly things have turned around. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you were a producer and you bought a combine or tractor a couple months before all the COVID stuff started to hit, you made out like a bandit. Mm-hmm. Because once that hit, then it was like everybody was wanting to buy. You couldn't buy it. You didn't know when you were going to get it, how much it was going to cost, but you still bought it regardless.
Right.
And that's across the board, construction, ag, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it happened so quickly. And now as you see, right now, the sentiment that we're in right now you got inventory sitting high on dealer lots. You got a of sentiment, even though it's very positive, second highest farm income like you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
We're still waiting to see because I'm sure commodity prices are influencing a lot of that.
Right.
But if you're a producer and you start thinking about, and they've got long memories, what it was like right before COVID, it seems that the velocity, how quickly it could change again with commodity prices taking a tick, could be another repeat of what we saw in COVID years.
Yeah.
So from one aspect, now might be the right time to buy. So I'm curious as to the velocity, how quickly these markets are changing and how fast the producers respond to it.
Yeah.
What do you predict as far as that velocity, and how you think it's going to slow down, probably a little faster? What's that look like?
Remember the drunk monkey thing that I told? That is a great point, because I've read some things about the volatility now, and if you look at any volatility index, and it's kind of like that policy index or the uncertainty index I threw up there, those are just blown off the charts, right? And we've seen that since COVID. And I can remember COVID, prices crashed so hard, I was doing some analysis of what this means to Nebraska in terms of receipts and things and how much things, and then, boy, it turned around and boom, we ended up the year in really good fashion. So I don't have any projections other than to say I think the speed at which information travels now we're going to see this kind of volatility continue, because boom, something happens in Russia or China, and it's mere seconds before it pops up on our phone, and markets are reacting to that. And I don't sense that pulling back. And so trying to manage both a farm and a dealership and try to build in that, I think farmers and ranchers are going to have to build in a little, what I'll call resilience. I really don't like that term, but they're going to have to put in some buffers in their operations to be able to withstand that volatility. And I think it's interesting because if you look, at least the last figures I saw, it was maybe about 15% of farmers used futures markets or other kinds of ways to reduce their risk and manage their risk. And it's been about that level for 20, 25 years. And I really think that they need to start looking at those kind of tools to help manage that risk, to take some of that, buffer some of that volatility. And I think the problem is that a lot of times farmers, they'll either themselves experienced a time that they did some risk management, some hedging and the like, and the market went the other way and they ended up, giving up some money. But they don't think about the times that if they would have put it in place and it could have saved them or provided some extra money. So I don't know if that's a good answer, Mark, but I think the volatility is going to continue, and I think we got to figure out ways to try to manage for that and think about that. Other questions? Any easier questions than that? Well, thank you very much. I appreciate, again, the opportunity to come over and visit with you guys. And you got my email address. As you're driving home, you think of something I said and got some thoughts on it, please shoot me an email, because I love the feedback. I love to hear what you guys are hearing out there too and what you're thinking. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.
We're going to take a 10-minute break, so we'll be back in here about